Hi everyone, welcome to my October wrap-up. So I am not necessarily on time with this month, but I'm definitely quicker about it than I was last month. So this month I read 5,003 pages, which sounds like a lot, but respective to my other months, this is objectively my worst month quantitatively. I read 15 books. The next lowest month would have been May, I think, with 17 books. And I'm a little confused when this happened because October was supposed to be like a really jam-packed month. I intentionally planned a TBR that was jam-packed to motivate me to push through a bunch of books that I've been wanting to read. And I don't know if it was because I was busy with school or if I was overwhelmed with the intense structure that I had to come with that TBR in order to make it viable. Either way, what we got is what we got. Now, I don't want to say it's a bad month. I had several good reads. I'm just disappointed. Let's just go ahead and get at it. I'm not necessarily going to be going at any particular pattern here. I'm just going to go as I have it laid out. So I mentioned 15 books. Let's go ahead and start with actually my lowest rated book, Girls Against God. This was a translated work that I read for Fortnight Frights. Let me just go ahead and stop now. I participated in several readathons this month. The Golden Girls Readathon, the Fortnight Frights Readathon, the Black-Oween-Athon, and BlackSFFathon. And I get overwhelmed, and honestly, I'm not at a point where I want to worry about tabulating those results. I'm pretty sure I got bingo in most of those, or I got close to it. And Golden Girls Murder Mystery, which I'll provide a link below for context, I did manage to win. I did not like this. Unfortunately, that's why I'm giving it 2 stars. Maybe on the high end of 2 stars, so almost 2.5, but I don't like giving halves below 3. It's just that there was no story. Like, I was really excited going into this because the concept and the cover, like, I loved it. I loved the idea of you had these sort of almost satanic cult or something. I'm not quite sure what it was supposed to be. Getting, like, maybe possessed or something. But nothing like that. I mean, maybe that sort of happened. The book itself was almost like a piece of abstract art to give you an idea of what the story was like. The writing wasn't particularly bad. It was just that the story didn't go anywhere. It was very much like we have this main character who is narrating her life. She's a immigrant from, I think, Norway, who spends some time in Norway, then comes to America for some time. And it's just her telling her story, but in like a very rambly way. We jump from one place to another in a very confusing amount of pacing. And I didn't understand where it was going. Like, when I go in, I thought it was more supernatural. And I checked again, the genre definitely says it's horror. But for a big part of the book, it felt as if it was just being super anti-religious, super anti-God, super atheist, which I'm not necessarily opposed to being against religion like that. It's just that it wasn't what I was expecting. And then when it finally took it to where I thought it was going to go, it was just weird. And unfortunately, while I liked it for its disturbing scenes, some of the disturbing moments that the author went for, it ultimately just falls flat for me, unfortunately. And it doesn't help that it was on ebook. It was an e-arc, rather. I should say that. This was an e-arc from NetGalley that I was granted, which I appreciate that to the publisher, to the NetGalley. But I'm naturally an audiobook reader. So moving on, I want to discuss 3 books in succession that all have similar ideas behind them in order of my least favorite to my most favorite. The first one's going to be My Soul to Keep by Tanner Readu. This is the first of a series. I think it's quadrilogy, whatever the fuck you call it. I said, no, that word was not a word. But this is a story about a man who is ancient, who is living a long life. It's his story of his new life with this woman and his child. And the problem is there's some issues here because as someone who basically survives indefinitely, he shouldn't be getting too attached. And he is. And so this is that story. And to best describe this, it is essentially like a vampire story without the sucking of blood, per se. And so in the end, it just ends up having the immortality conversation that you see in a lot of vampire books without taking it that extra like gruesome direction. So I gave this 4 stars. This was I was reading because a group of people are doing a book buddy read for this and doing a discussion of it. Erica from The Broken Spine, Bree from Luck Petition, Ashley from Bookish Realm, I think, and 2 other people. I think that video is already scheduled and I'll link to it in the cards, but I did like it. I'm definitely going to continue in the series. It isn't my favorite Tanner Readu, but it also isn't my least favorite, I think. Next up, I would go with Wild Seed by Octavia Butler. First off, this cover will officially be my favorite color of the month, perhaps of the year. I don't know, it's just so fucking gorgeous. I love the orange and the blue. I always love blue, even though red is definitely my color. This was for the Octavia Butler slow read as well, and the discussion for this is happening this month, I think, actually. And this was the first of a series of Octavia Butler's, and it's called the Pattern series. Wild Seed is the story of this young woman and this not this young woman, she's not young at all. It's literally the inverse. This story is a story of a witch of sorts. It's this woman who has this ability, this unique ability where she can do certain things, among them shapeshifting and sort of healing herself. And she comes across this man who is essentially immortal. And they are not the same, they are different in a lot of ways. And it's this sort of almost romance / clash between the two of them as they live throughout their lives. We start out back in, I want to say like 1600s or earlier, and following these two characters. And the best way I can describe the direction this goes, I mean, maybe it's not the best direction, but the way that comes to mind is X-Men. It definitely feels sort of X-Men and the variety of powers that we see, and I did like it for that. I ended up giving this 4.5 out of 5 stars. Why, you ask? I don't think I had a lot of negative things to say about this, because I did love this. I think it'll have great rereadability. It'll be a lot of fun to reread. It was an easy read. It wasn't too difficult, but the pacing was definitely abrupt, and that's probably the biggest thing. The pacing wasn't the best. I mean, I understand why it had to happen when you're dealing with characters who are so old, who are literally immortal. You have to be able to jump through their lifespans if you want to give this particular story that she's trying to tell. And I think that was the biggest critique. I don't remember, but I did love this a lot. Next would be the Gilda Stories by Jewel Gomez. And this is one that I gave 4.5 stars as well, but I would say I'm pushing 5 stars for sure. And I read this as a buddy read with Erica from the Broken Spine. We were supposed to be doing a live show discussing this book on the 1st of November. That didn't happen. It got pushed back to the 8th, and now it's pushed back again to December. I'm not quite sure the exact date, but I did really love this one. It reminds me of a lot of things. I think it's almost like Anne Rice in a type of story, because it follows this young woman who was a slave, and she ends up getting turned into a vampire, and she takes the vampire who sired her. She takes her name, and it's her story living out her life. And while it is like a more traditional vampire story, and unlike Tanner Reeves' book, it takes like a different perspective than say Anne Rice does, where Anne Rice presents to you these very morally ambiguous characters, morally ambiguous to evil, should we say. This takes a different perspective. Like, sure, there are morally to problematic characters in this book, problematic as in they're just not perfect people, but our main character, our central character, she has this basic tenet of wanting to do good and wanting to contradict this idea of vampires are evil, but she takes a step further by having a queer, or rather lesbian, black vampire who is pursuing this type of life. And so I liked the direction it went in. It had a lot of really interesting conversations. The story was just really immersive, and I really like this book a lot. Since it's happening again in December, if I can find like a period where I can just snip it in December before we have a live show, I'd love to reread this again, because I will enjoy it, but also because it'll make it for a nice refresher for that conversation. Highly recommend this book. It is one of my favorites. Honestly, these two are both one of my favorites this month. Next up is another 4.5 star, and that is The Dark Fantastic by Ebony Elizabeth Thomas. And honestly, it feels like it's been so long since I read this, because it was technically like over a month now. And this is a nonfiction book that discusses race and the imagination from Harry Potter to the Hunger Games. And this discusses race in the context of Harry Potter, Hunger Games, but as well as Merlin TV show and The Vampire Diaries. Those two I haven't seen, but The Hunger Games and Harry Potter, of course, I have been involved in those fandoms. And it was really fascinating discussion to be able to just give it sort of in-depth look at these types of fandoms while simultaneously using them as a point of context for the larger conversation about the use of race in fantastic fiction. And it was great. It was a great discussion. I really liked this book. It was really well done. It was almost academic in how it's structured and how it presents, sort of breaks down each fandom, but not in a way that I don't think is accessible. I think it is the perfect kind of academia that has the structure that I like, while still being not too cerebral for the reader to be able to retain it. That makes sense. All in all, I really like this. I would love to basically watch the Merlin and the Vampire Diaries and then reread this and see what I think. This book does spoil every fandom, because she basically walks you through what happens in those fandoms to help give us some context. Like, you don't have to be familiar with them to be able to follow along with what's going on. She gives you context to what happens in the story, so we can understand exactly what they were doing and how they either fit into this mold of how race is used or how they break it for better or worse. Dracula by Bram Stoker. Maybe you've never heard of this before, but this is a vampire book that was made in the 1800s. It is actually one of the oldest, fun fact. Now, obviously, I know everyone's heard about this book. I'm disappointed in myself here because I really wanted to like this. I mean, it's Dracula, it's a classic. I've seen plenty of adaptations, and I think that helped me enjoy this more. I even listened to the Audible adaptation that had a full cast, but ultimately it fell flat for me. The story doesn't focus enough on Dracula. We get too much of the background scene, and to me that felt dull. I'm not a big fan of Victorian literature as it stands, and all of that combined with the fact that it's set up in the structure of letters made it harder for me to follow. I may end up reading this eventually in my life because it is a classic for a reason, but this first go through, it was just okay. Like, it's not that it isn't as creepy and at times really terrifying, I think. It didn't work. Angelica. Next up is Raising Demons by Shirley Jackson. This was her second memoir that she wrote in her lifetime. And I did a full review on this, as well as Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life by Ruth Franklin. Gave this 5 stars and gave this 3 stars. This was a sort of calculated look at her life where she's presenting herself in a certain way, almost like the perfect 50s housewife. At the same time, there seems to be some underlying satirical context going on there. This is her biography, but it's also a literary critique of all of her work that basically uses her work and the analysis of her work as a way of better informing her life and her mindset that she had when writing this book and throughout her life, rather. Again, I did a full review for this. I loved that book so much. I was so happy at how thrilled I was. It's one of the best biographies I've ever read, quite frankly. Next up is the only other 5-star I read this month, and that is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. And this is a thriller Gothic novel about a young woman who marries this rich man whose wife recently died. I say married. She comes across with him and they end up getting married, and she moves in, and Rebecca is his ex-wife, rather his dead wife. The story is called that because everywhere she looks, she sees Rebecca. I'm talking figuratively. It is somewhat of a ghost story, but I don't want to say more than that because I don't want to reveal anything. What you see is that everyone around her, from a new husband to her new staff, because it's a very wealthy family, all they ever do is compare her to Rebecca, or at least that's how she feels. And I really loved this book so much. I'm pretty sure I talk about it in Friday Reads. If so, I'll link above. It's a book that is just outside of Victorian, which I loved. I loved this historical time. I loved the atmosphere. I loved how surprising it was, how thrilling it was at times, and I loved how it ended. Like, sure, our characters are very problematic, and I particularly like our main character because, not Rebecca, like the main character who we're following along, because she feels very self-conscious, and while I understand that could be annoying as a reader, I find it very relatable. I understand always asking yourself, what are people thinking about me? And why do I care what people think about me? Like, it's entirely human. Now, next up, a book that I found very similar to Rebecca in a lot of ways is A Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. And this is her second book. I came into this a little anxious because I had heard mixed reviews. All in all, I'm glad I read this. I think it was an enjoyable experience, but I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars because it felt very slow at first. While I did like where it went and the story she told and how she told it, it ultimately isn't enough to say the fact that I just felt very sluggish at the first part. This is a story about a woman who comes to check in on her cousin who recently moved into this house with this wealthy family who's very racist. It's just set in a similar time period, I think, as Rebecca, maybe the 50s, not the 30s, or maybe that was in the 1800s. I don't remember. But, you know, it's a similar time period, so the atmosphere is very similar. It's very gothic. It's very ominous. Anyway, she comes to inspect the house because her cousin seems to be ill. And while she's there, weird things start to happen. She starts to see things. And it's this question of, are these real or is she having delusions? What it turns out to be, I think, is very creative. It's a very unique take on a haunted house narrative. And I really liked that aspect. It was really unnerving and creepy. And I also love the use of race in the story. I do wonder if maybe I would enjoy it more a second go around, because the more I talk about it, the more I do love the idea in my head, and I do remember loving like the second half of the book. But for now, I am settling on 3.5, as much as I did like the idea and actually the execution at the second half of it. In addition to reading Rebecca and Dracula, I was also reading more Victorian and Gothic literature, and that is Frankenstein, finally. And this one, I'm very happy to report, I loved. I did a whole book discussion with this, and this book I'm about to talk about, with Erica for the Broken Spine. You can watch that video if you want to hear more. But long story short, I felt like This was a very effective story that was really unnerving, very creepy, and I don't know how I lived my entire life, 30 years, without knowing what happens in Frankenstein. I loved the direction it went and the conversation it had about good and bad and who the monster is and what makes you a monster. And even if you are a monster or rather a victim, what do you have a right to do, and at what point do you stop being the victim and become the monster yourself? Fantastic book, of course. So I give that 4.5 stars. I think the reason I didn't give it more because, again, it dragged a couple parts. For the most part, though, it was really good. Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Sadawi, and this is a book that is a sort of retelling or a reimagining of Frankenstein. It is set in Baghdad during, I think, 2008 era, when you have this war going on, and it's this very gruesome and dark time period where you have this person, or rather monster, Frankenstein, essentially created from the recombining of body parts. This story went in a different direction. While it had very similar themes and the conversation that it had, it was magical instead of scientific, which is to say, instead of science fiction, it was fantastical in how the monster comes into being. And I found that to be less creepy, personally. I don't know why. I just didn't feel as oh my god, mad scientist-y. I also found this as a horror book to not be as effective for me. Now, in the live, someone mentions the fact that in Baghdad, in the Middle East, what is horror is different than here in America, or rather here, in the West. So it's important to recognize that what is horrific there is different. I'm not saying it's not horror. I think it was a really fascinating conversation to be had about what is horror and how that varies depending on the region, the culture. I gave this 3.5 stars just because it seemed very slow at times, and I did not think the story was that compelling, honestly. For more, again, you can watch that whole 2-hour discussion. We're almost there. Next up, I read another classic, The Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell Chestnut, and this one, unfortunately, I did not love. I think I gave it 3 stars. I read this because I recently, back in March, Jesus Christ, this year, because I read Conjure Woman by Afia Takora, is how you pronounce it, I believe, which I think, and Jerry Flonk's pages recently read this and did a review for it. I really like this story. It is historical fiction, magical realism, set during the Civil War and just after the Civil War, looking at these women who do this sort of almost like fantastical things. Basically, they were the doctors, and they basically did magical things, and I think it was like their particular religion. And this is, I think, one of the classic stories sort of communicating the variety of different, I guess, mythos that existed in this time period. Unfortunately, while I thought it was intriguing concepts, it ended up just not working for me. I found it hard to connect. I know I was saying that as a white person. It might not be meant for me per se, but I'm glad that I read it because it was an intriguing introduction. I just didn't find the story to be as good. The writing for me, didn't work very well. Also, the way the story is told, they're basically just short story collection. I don't really have a good reason. I couldn't connect, and so 3 stars. Next up, more short stories, which another reason why I think this month might have taken so long was because when I read my short stories, I took my sweet time. I wanted to really appreciate the short stories I was reading. Let's go ahead and talk about After the People Lights Have Gone Up, my Stephen Graham Jones. This is a short story collection, and I loved this. This, first off, such a sturdy cover. Like, what the, I know people want flop, but I love the sturdiness. Sorry, focusing on the camera. Yeah, this is weird science fiction, fantasy, horror collection. Like, it's all horror, but it uses science fiction and fantasy and just weird fiction in general. And I love this. I think I gave it 4 stars just because while it's very effective for the most part, as per usual, I do get confused a lot of times, which I'm okay with. That's the nature of weird fiction. I think it has a lot of rereadability from that standpoint. It works really well. It's just a really great horror short story collection. I really am loving Stephen Graham Jones. Even when I still end up loving the experience overall, even if it is confusing as hell at times. Next up, I read another 4-star is Final Cuts, New Tales of Hollywood Horror and Other Spectacles, edited by Ellen Datlow. This is Ellen Datlow's newest horror collection, I believe, that she released, and she releases a bunch of them. She has a shit ton of horror anthologies, and I'm pretty sure I talked about this briefly as introduction in one of my Friday reads, but I ended up reading through all of it. I even did my first ever stopping to annotate books, like I gave reviews sort of at the end of each short story. My 4 stars, I think, from average, but there were some so-so books stories in here, but overall I think they were pretty good, and there were some stories in here that I just absolutely loved. And the idea is the stories are sort of centered around this idea of the theme of horror, classic horror in film. And the variety of stories in here are really good. That's one thing I love about Ellen Datlow, is just she gives us such variety. There's always giving something you like. And even with a theme, like, things can get pretty abstract in the direction it goes. I want to do a standalone review for this where I talk about some of my favorite stories. They get really weird and really dark, and I really did like this story. And this story I ended up reading over the course of 2 weeks, I think, and it's a really long time for me. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm getting so behind on my reading, but at the same time, I didn't want to rush through this. So I didn't, and it's like nearly 500 pages, but it was good. I've read some so-so anthologies by Ellen Datlow, some really great ones. I think this is one of the great ones, personally. That is it. Those are all the books that I've read this month. Hope you have a good day and stay safe.